Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us again today. I am Mark Siegel, founder and CEO of ESG Today, and welcome to day 3 of our webinar series, which is a collaboration between ESG Today and SE Advisory Services by Schneider Electric. Once again, let me just start off with a quick housekeeping note. Before we dive into the session, we're not going to be able to have live Q&A, but please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section, and your questions will be answered by email. So let's get into it from there. This seminar series focuses on the foundations of environmental performance, where each day we will be taking you through different aspects, including measurement of environmental metrics, management of environmental risks and impacts, setting targets to improve environmental performance, and taking action to improve environmental performance. Over the course of the week, we've been exploring how these topics relate to each other, and provide a roadmap for both future-proofing your sustainability strategy and, of course, achieving an A in CDP. So far, in the first 2 days, we've covered measurement, governance, and strategy. And yesterday, we covered risk and adaptation. And we've seen how these topics feed into a roadmap that both future-proofs sustainability strategy and leads to an A in CDP. So today, we are going to take a deep dive into we're going to do all things value chain. We're going to help you understand what exactly your value chain is, how to best manage that value chain, and how to develop a supplier engagement process to decarbonize your value chain. And to do that, once again, we've got another great expert panel for you for today's session, including Tiana Wen, who was with us in our first seminar on Monday. Tiana is a sustainability consultant who specializes greenhouse gas inventory development and brings a background in sustainability planning in sustainability planning and management to her work. And Isabella Harrison, a senior sustainability consultant who is SE Advisory Services supply chain expert, specializing in designing supply chain decarbonization programs. So to kick things off, to start off today's session, let me hand it over to Tiana.
Thank you for the introduction, Mark, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's seminar. Today we will cover our objectives. We'll introduce some key elements of environmental performance management, and we'll describe the value chain management by outlining how to go further than this webinar. We'll discuss how to identify next steps in your journey from there. Let me see where we are in our, okay, perfect. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Whether your company currently reports to CDP or not, there is meaningful value you can take away from our session today. For those of whose organizations do report to CDP, we'll explore how you can demonstrate a strong commitment to addressing climate and nature-related dependencies and impacts. We'll also discuss how to work with suppliers more effectively to drive decarbonization and how to leverage CDP's A-list criteria as a strategic anchor to enhance value chain management. For organizations that do not report to CDP, we'll provide an overview of how to build a best-in-class value chain management process, one that identifies and responds to impacts and dependencies in a structured way. We'll also talk about how to develop a successful supplier engagement approach and how organizations can build resilience to evolving regulatory and reporting requirements by proactively mapping and prioritizing value chain risks. If you haven't joined any of our other seminars and aren't familiar with CDP, the short introduction to CDP is that it's the world's most comprehensive environmental disclosure database and benchmarking platform across climate, forest, and water themes. It updates annually, so scoring reflects the latest best practices, and continual alignment with other initiatives has made it a centralized cross-cutting disclosure. That's why we use its A-list criteria as a strategic anchor. Go to the next slide. Thank you. Before we continue, I'd like to briefly walk through some essential definitions that will guide our discussion, especially as they relate to CDP reporting and value chain management. You may be familiar with some of these definitions if you attended yesterday's seminar, but I want to cover them really quickly here. First, we have risk. In the CDP context, risk refers to operational, financial, or reputational impacts an organization may face due to climate and nature-related hazards. CDP asks companies to identify these risks across their entire value chain and quantify their potential financial impacts. This is vital for understanding where suppliers may be vulnerable and where resilience needs to be strengthened. Next, we have opportunity. CDP encourages companies not only to report risks, but also to identify positive opportunities such as cost savings, innovation potential, or new revenue streams that come from mitigation or adaptation efforts. Within value chain management, these often take the shape of supplier collaborations, efficiency improvements, or material changes that drive both environmental and financial benefits. We then look at adaptation. Adaptation is about adjusting to current or projected climate impacts. CDP places strong emphasis on this, asking organizations to describe how they and their suppliers will remain resilient under different climate scenarios. This is especially important in value chains where extreme weather, water scarcity, or ecosystem degradation can disrupt operations. Another key term is dependencies. This refers to aspects like nature or aspects of nature, like water, healthy soils, or biodiversity, that an organization relies on to function. CDP's alignment with emerging nature related frameworks means companies now understand and disclose these dependencies, many of which occur upstream in the supply chain. Mapping dependencies helps identify where nature related risks are concentrated. Finally, we have impact. In CDP terminology, impact refers to the positive or negative effects an organization or its value chain has on the environment, whether that's emissions, water withdrawals, land use change, or ecosystem degradation. Because much of a company's footprint occurs outside its direct operations, assessing impacts across the value chain is central to CDP's reporting and to building a credible sustainability strategy. Together, these definitions provide a common language for understanding how CDP evaluates performance and how organizations can engage their value chain more effectively. Now that we've aligned on these definitions, we can start to see how they form the foundation for effective environmental performance management. These concepts aren't just terminology, they are the lens through which CDP evaluates organizations and how companies assess their value chains. To connect today's session with what was covered in yesterday's session on risk and adaptation, I want to show how environmental performance management has evolved and how this aligns closely with CDP's expectations. Yesterday, we talked about the traditional approach of managing climate-related risks. The process of risk and adaptation assessments included scenario selection and analysis, followed by identifying and prioritizing risks and opportunities. Organizations would then quantify the financial implications and incorporate those findings into financial planning and enterprise risk management. This is essentially the foundation of TCFD, and CDP has mirrored this structure for many years in its questionnaire. With value chain management, we consider environmental performance in this context, which requires a broader understanding of physical and transition risk across the entire value chain, not just within operations. This includes understanding how suppliers, distributors, and customers all contribute to or are affected by environmental change. On the right side of the slide, you'll see this shift illustrated through a more holistic model of value chain management. Organizations are being asked to understand the pressures their operations and supply chain place on nature, the dependencies they have on natural systems, the impacts they create through emissions, land use, water consumption, and other activities, and the services that nature provides which support business continuity. This perspective is rooted in CDP's current direction. CDP now integrates climate, water, forests, and emerging nature related themes, emphasizing how impacts and dependencies flow across the value chain. It is through this approach that CDP asserts companies must look beyond immediate risks and consider how ecosystems themselves underpin business resilience. The takeaway is this. Environmental performance management is no longer about responding to risks. It's about understanding how your organization interacts with nature, where pressures occur, where dependencies exist, and where impacts are created across your value chain. And this is exactly what CDP is moving toward, a complete picture of how businesses contribute to and are influenced by environmental change. And this sets the stage for our next section where we will explore the value chain and how to operationalize this broader view and embed it into your sustainability strategy.
Okay, thanks, Tiana. But before I pass it over, let me just ask you, value chain seems like a pretty, it's a broad, all-encompassing term. Can you just, explain or dive a little deeper into how you're thinking about it in the context of today's session?
This is a really good segue to our next section. So I'll jump in and say, Anna, if we could take to the next slide, that'd be great. So thank you so much, Tiana and Mark, for teeing me up with this question. And I'm going to start by just taking us back to basics and thinking through what exactly do we mean by value chain. And there are many different definitions of this term. One is that a value chain is a sequence of activities that an organization performs to design, produce, market, deliver, and support goods and services for customers. The concept was first introduced by Michael Porter, a businessman and Harvard Business School professor many years back, as a framework for analyzing how firms create value and achieve competitive advantage through coordinated business processes. So that's sort of the root of the term. And he considered that the value chain includes primary activities. Those could be things like inbound logistics and operations, as well as support activities like procurement. So how are we thinking about this in the context of environmental performance management? Well, in the context of sort of the environmental lens and greenhouse gas accounting in particular, we're really talking about the full array of emissions from upstream Scope 3 emissions, otherwise known as your supply chain emissions. This could be sources like purchased goods and services that go into the goods a business sells. It could be your operational Scope 1 and 2 emissions as well. And then also your downstream Scope 3 emissions, everything from waste generated in operations to customers' emissions from the use of sold products. So value chain is clearly a very, very broad term. And if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk through how organizations like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and CDP are talking about value chain management in particular, just to add on to what Tiana shared already. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, just to give a little bit more history here, they introduced their corporate value chain and reporting standard back in 2011. So we've had that Scope 3 accounting standard for quite some time now. And they really because increasingly companies were realizing that they really need to account for their greenhouse gas emissions along their full value chains and product portfolios. This allowed them to comprehensively manage greenhouse gas related risks and opportunities. So this quote is directly from that standard. And then meanwhile, in the latest sort of CDP guidance from 2025, CDP noted that in order to reduce environmental impact globally, organizations have to engage with their value chain, both upstream and downstream, from suppliers to customers to stakeholders and other partners. Supply chain engagement is my own area of expertise, so I'm also going to ground us by sharing a few key statistics on supply chain emissions on the next slide. Which is great. So these are all statistics from CDP, actually, and they provide context on why managing your supply chain in particular, or your upstream value chain, is such an important piece of overall value chain management. So just looking from left to right here, we know that emissions from suppliers are, on average, about 3/4 of a company's emissions footprint, typically. So big risk and big opportunity. And then engaging suppliers can have a really significant impact. And this one key stat points to that, noting that suppliers are more than twice as likely to set greenhouse gas reduction targets if they receive help or support or pressure from their own customers. And then finally, with this financial stat here on the right, we see that managing supply chain climate-related risks are a really important component of value chain management. So we're going to navigate to the next slide to talk through value chain management in greater detail. So there's a lot of information on this slide, as you can see, and I'm going to start by providing some high-level context for how we put this framework together. So to start, as Tiana's talked about, this value chain management process is grounded in some other frameworks. So specifically, this concept comes from a double materiality assessment lens. So for those that are not familiar, a double materiality assessment is a structured approach used to identify and prioritize sustainability topics based on two dimensions, their financial materiality and impact materiality. And it's really a cornerstone of sustainability reporting under leading regulatory frameworks. These include the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is developed by the European Commission. And at its core, the double materiality assessment really requires companies to systematically assess their value chain dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, those terms Tiana defined, and to translate these insights into clear policies, actions, and measurable targets. So this is where this graphic becomes particularly useful for illustrating the process. So how does value chain management work in practice? I'm going to walk through each of these 6 steps here on the slide. So first and foremost, we start by mapping direct operations and the full upstream and downstream value chain. This gives us visibility into who is involved at every stage, from your tier 1 suppliers all the way to tier 2 through N, to your customers. And this step is all about understanding what you control, where you have influence, and where the biggest exposure points may be. Second here, we identify the most significant dependencies and impacts across the chain. And this helps isolate where the company's footprint and exposure are the greatest and where management attention is needed the most. Up third here is prioritization at the site level. So at this more granular level, we are identifying sensitive locations to determine which individual sites or assets create the largest risks or impacts. And this can help create a short list of material locations, those that require targeted actions or investments. At 4.0 here, we have the prioritization of suppliers, something that I spend a lot of time doing myself with our clients. So we in this step evaluate suppliers against dependencies and impacts and determine which suppliers are falling above the significance threshold. And this supplier segmentation step enables companies to focus their engagement, their due diligence, and improvement efforts on the suppliers that matter the most. At 4.1 here, set requirements. In this step, for those priority suppliers that we've identified, we define clear, consistent environmental requirements and expectations. And this could include putting in place incentives for suppliers to take action, could be mechanisms for monitoring or non-compliance escalation, and the whole continuous improvement process. At 4.2, we have engaged suppliers. This is where we move from those requirements to really the partnership. And supplier engagement can take many forms. We talk a lot about capacity building with your suppliers. Data sharing is a huge, big, important topic. And then innovation or collaboration through joint improvement plans. And in this step, the goal is really to strengthen alignment and help suppliers meet performance expectations. So moving on to step 5, interconnections. This is really where we connect the dots, evaluating how risks, opportunities, dependencies, and impacts relate to each other. And this systems level view helps us identify synergies, trade-offs, and areas where coordinated action will have the largest impact. Then finally, at point 6, we consolidate all these insights into a public-facing environmental policy that reflects the company's key impacts, risks, and commitments. And this policy really becomes the anchor for external engagement and reinforces transparency across the value chain. So that was a lot of information. I'll stop there in case Mark has any questions for me.
Okay, thanks, Isabel. First, let me just say thanks for the Michael Porter reference. It just took me back to my business school days, and I really enjoyed that. So thanks a lot. But looking at this chart, one of the things that jumps out to me as something that I hear a lot, I hear a lot of talk about is prioritization of suppliers. What you labeled as step 4.0. So while just having you here, given your experience in this area. Can you just touch on how companies are prioritizing suppliers for engagement?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, Mark, and glad you appreciated the Michael Porter reference. It brought me back as well to think about that. So in terms of supplier prioritization, when we work with companies to segment their suppliers, we really start by looking at their largest tier 1 suppliers by emissions or spend. To get a sense of their sort of material impact. And we really look at their maturity levels for various environmental management criteria, the criteria we're talking about today. So for example, are they measuring their own emissions? Have they done a basic scope 1 and 2 inventory? Have they done more advanced measurement? Have they set targets? How ambitious are those targets? Are they aligned with your own ambition, or are they falling short of it, or even maybe more advanced and you can learn from them? So those are really important steps for the prioritization or segmentation of suppliers. And then another really key sort of piece of information we look at is the company's level of influence with their suppliers. And you can evaluate influence based on financial influence, sort of level of partnership. If you have a 10-year contract with a supplier, for example, you have a great deal of influence. And this helps companies really determine where they can make the biggest difference through supplier engagement. So hope that answers your question. Great today.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. That's really insightful. Thank you. So great. Let me pass it back to Tiana to take us the rest of the way.
Okay, great. Again, lots of information on this slide. So I'm going to walk us through this chart here. So this slide is going to show how CDP's A-list value chain management expectations align with other major regulatory and disclosure frameworks. We've assessed whether it will take minimal, moderate, or significant effort to align with each framework based on key components of value chain management, such as mapping operations and value chain, identifying and prioritizing dependencies and impacts, assessing interconnections, and engaging with suppliers. So you'll see those listed under framework there, and we'll kind of move across the screen. The key message here is that CDP is generally ahead in terms of detail, especially on nature-related topics like impacts, dependencies, and supplier engagement. On the left, you'll see a strong alignment with ESRS and CSRD. These frameworks require similar mapping of operations and value chains, identification and prioritization of impacts and dependencies, and supplier engagement. So companies reporting under CSRD will already be well positioned for CDP A-list expectations and vice versa. For IFRS, and you'll see TCFD, TNFD, we sit somewhere. Oh, sorry, I switched that up. For IFRS and TCFD, you'll see at the end there, on the other hand, they require far less detail on nature-related topics. So we're seeing that the alignment is not quite there with CDP A-list and or not required in terms of value chain management. So IFRS focuses more on financial materiality and doesn't require the deeper environmental mapping that CDP does. And TCFD is climate only. So nature and value chain topics don't typically apply here. When we look at GRI and TNFD, we're sitting somewhere in the middle. GRI requires impact assessments and ecosystem considerations, while TNFD pushes even further with detailed ecosystem mapping and value chain analysis, very similar to where CDP expects to move going forward. Finally, for California regulations like SB 253 and SB 261, the overlap is limited. SB 253 is emissions only, and SB 261 is focused on risk and opportunities. So there is overlap. The broader nature-related mapping required by CDP doesn't apply here, but there is some overlap there. And so, again, the main takeaway is that if your organization is working towards CDP A-list performance, you're already building those key capabilities that align closely with CSRD, GRI, and TNFD. Other frameworks may require less, but CDP's level of detail can help future-proof your disclosures across multiple regulatory systems. And we can go to the very next slide. All right, talking about going further. So as we wrap up today's seminar, I want to leave you with a clear sense of what it looks like to keep going further on your sustainability journey. Whether you go where you go next really depends on where your organization is today. So for those earlier in their journey, the first step is to map, assess, and prioritize across your value chain. This means identifying where your biggest environmental risks, impacts, and dependencies sit, and which suppliers or sites should be your first focus area. So as Isabel mentioned earlier in the supply chain mapping. From there, the next move is identifying priority sites and shaping your supplier program. This is where you set your ambition, you define governance, and make sure your internal teams are aligned and ready to support any ongoing engagement. As you mature, the focus shifts to collecting supplier data and quantifying impacts and dependencies. So really building those relationships with your suppliers in order to get quality data. Whether through campaigns or automated tools, the goal here is to get reliable environmental data and help suppliers stay engaged through simple, practical resources. The next step is all about people. Upskilling buyers and engaging suppliers. Procurement teams become key drivers of sustainability, supported with training, communication tools, and collaborative processes. And finally, the most advanced stage is direct collaboration with suppliers. Here, you co-develop site-level solutions, reduce emissions together, and partner on long-term resilience initiatives. No matter where you are today, each step builds momentum and strengthens your ability to be resilient and competitive against and future ready against any frameworks and regulations. And that wraps us up today. Thank you for spending time with us today. We're really excited to support you as you continue moving forward in your sustainability journey. I'm going to pass it back to Mark to wrap us up.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully I'm not jumping the gun closing the session like I did yesterday. But yeah, I just want to thank everyone for another really great session on a really important topic. I'd especially like to thank Tiana and Isabel for taking us through the session, the third session in this week's series. Once again, we hope to see everyone back here at the same time tomorrow for our final session, where we're going to wrap up the series with another expert panel to walk you through transition plans, decarbonization, and targets. Again, just want to mention to please remember to leave questions in the Q&A section and we'll answer by email. And once again, a reminder that the seminar recordings will be shared with you via email. So that's it. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.